My name is Dorothée Savard. I was born in Vanderhoof, British Columbia, on the 4th of March, 1948, and I am recording this on the 18th of January, 2023, in the kitchen of my house on Foothills Boulevard in Prince George, where I have lived for 41 years. I am 74 years old. I was employed as a civilian records clerk with the Prince George Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police from September of 1968 until my retirement in June of 2011. 43 years. In that time, I typed approximately 14,000 documents by my own informal count, and I sealed my name to every one of them with the care and discretion that the position required. I kept every secret that office held, and there were a number of them, and I am proud of that. I am proud of most of it. There is one document I typed that I have not discussed with another living soul in 52 years, and the reason I am speaking now is that Gerald Pallister died on the 28th of December, 3 weeks ago, at 87 years of age, and when I sat in the back pew at Sacred Heart and watched them carry his coffin past me, I understood that the last of the promise had expired with him. Gerald was the last named witness in that file. Henri Vachon has been dead since 1994. Nora Pallister went in 2009. Pitt Larocque in 2015. Everett Dufour in 2019. I am the last one who was in that kitchen on the 7th of November, 1971, and I am the last one who knows what was in the sealed portion of Constable File PGE 714402. I am going to describe it now as accurately as I can, because I believe someone should have it, and because I do not think the world is diminished by knowing. Henri Vachon was 53 years old when I came to work at the Prince George Detachment. He had the physical presence of a man who had spent his life outdoors and had stopped being surprised by what he found there, which is the only way I know how to describe the particular quality of stillness he carried. He was not a large man, but he occupied his space completely. He was from Chicoutimi originally, Quebec, and he had been posted to northern British Columbia in 1961 after a decade in northern Ontario, and he had the manner of someone for whom cold and distance were simply the conditions of work, not hardships to be mentioned. He drank his coffee black, and he did not waste words, and he treated the civilian staff with a formality that stopped just short of warmth, which in that detachment and in those years was considered generous. He was my superior for the entirety of my time at the Prince George office, until he retired in 1986, and I trusted his judgment in every professional matter that arose in those 18 years. I trusted it in this one too. I want that understood before I describe what he brought to my desk. It was the 22nd of October, 1971. I know the date because I still have the small calendar I kept on my desk in those years. The kind with a spiral binding and a page for each month. And I wrote on the October page, in pencil, the initials HV and 2 question marks, which was my private shorthand for something I needed to think about. Henri came to my station at approximately 10:30 in the morning, after the other clerk, a young man named Régent Coté, who has nothing to do with this story, had gone to the filing room. Henri placed a handwritten page on my desk and stood at the edge of my station and said, in a voice that was considerably quieter than his usual speaking voice, that he needed this typed onto a standard incident summary form, sealed in a P-series envelope with red tape, and placed in the restricted cabinet under his name. He said he would explain the circumstances when he could, and that, in the meantime, I should read it, type it, and tell no one I had done so. He said this the way he said most things, as a statement of practical arrangement rather than an instruction, and he waited for me to nod before he walked back to his office and closed the door. I held the handwritten page for a moment before I read it. I was 23 years old. I had been in that office for 3 years. I was not a person who read documents before typing them, as a rule. My job was to produce accurate transcriptions, and the habit of not reading what I typed had served me well. I read this one. The handwritten page was a summary of a conversation Henri had conducted on the 5th of October with Gerald Pallister, age 35, registered trapper of rural Thorth, outside the community of Hickson, which is approximately 40 kilometers south of Prince George, along the Fraser. Gerald had contacted the detachment by telephone on the 2nd of October and asked to speak with a specific officer by name, which is unusual, and Henri had noted in his summary that he believed Gerald had asked for him specifically because Henri had once assisted Gerald's father in a property dispute in 1964, and Gerald considered him a man whose discretion could be relied upon. The conversation had taken place at Gerald's property, in the kitchen of the farmhouse there, in the presence of Gerald's wife, Nora, who was 32 at the time. The summary ran to 2 full handwritten pages in Henri's careful small script. I am going to tell you what it said, as best I can reconstruct it from the document I typed that morning, and from the statement Gerald himself gave me 6 weeks later, which I will come to. Gerald Pallister had been working a trapline in the Draw country east of his property, in the forest above the Fraser Bench, since 1959. He knew that ground the way a man knows a place he has walked in every season for 12 years, which is to say, he knew not only its geography, but its habit, what it sounded like in the second week of November, when the temperature dropped to -20 and the spruce snapped with cold, what it smelled like in early April when the runoff started, which animals denned where, which straws held water through August, and which ones dried by July. He was not a man given to imagination. Henri noted that specifically in his summary. He wrote that Gerald Pallister was methodical, observant, and not the type to report what he had not seen clearly and repeatedly. I typed those words, and I believed them, because they matched what Henri himself was, and Henri did not describe other people in terms he did not also apply to himself. Gerald had first noticed the signs in the winter of 1965. He did not know what he was looking at first. He said as much. Prints in the snow that were not bear and not moose and not anything he could name, from 12 years on that trapline. He measured one with his hand, which he said was approximately 9 inches across the palm, and the print was wider than his hand, with his fingers spread, and the stride was considerably longer than anything a man could manage in deep snow, while wearing boots. He saw the prints in 3 locations over 2 winters. Nothing to Nora or to anyone else, because he had no explanation to offer, and because offering observations without explanations was not his habit. The 3rd winter he found a cache of firewood, split and stacked, against the side of his equipment shed. He had not split it. Nora had not split it. The wood was split cleanly and stacked the way a person who knew what they were doing would stack it, the way Gerald himself stacked it, and there was approximately a full cord of it. He stood looking at it for a long time. He said, in his statement, that he stood looking at it for perhaps 20 minutes. And he was not a man who stood and looked at things for 20 minutes ordinarily. That was the 4th of December, 1967. That was the first time. There would be many more. Henri had written in his summary that Gerald described a progression of encounters over the following 4 years that he characterized as a kind of negotiation, though he did not use that word. It was Henri's word, from Henri's interpretation of what Gerald described. Gerald had left food at the edge of the tree line the winter after the firewood. He had not done this consciously or with any plan. He told Henri that Nora had a habit of leaving the heel of a bread loaf on the fence post for the ravens, which were a kind of ongoing amusement for her, and that he had simply started leaving larger items alongside the bread. Venison scraps from butchering, a haunch that had gone slightly past what they would eat themselves. He said he told himself it was for the ravens and the foxes, and he was willing to admit, in 1971, that he had known it was not for the ravens and the foxes. The items were always gone by morning. He found on 3 occasions in 1968 and 1969 bundles of spruce boughs cut and left near his back door, which Nora began using as floor mats in the mudroom without asking where they came from. She knew, he said. She did not ask him, and he did not volunteer it. That is what they believed at the time. That is what they were prepared to believe. The first time Gerald saw the creature directly was in March of 1969. He had walked up the draw at dusk to check a set, and he came around a bend in the trail where a large spruce had fallen across the path some years before, the trunk of it, at about chest height on Gerald, and on the other side of the fallen trunk, approximately 12 feet away, the creature was standing. Gerald told Henri that he stopped, and the creature stopped, and they looked at each other for a period of time he could not estimate, though he said it was long enough that he was aware of the light changing. He said it was approximately 8 feet tall when it was standing fully upright, which it was. He described the shoulders as broad to a degree that he could not find a human comparison for, and he described the face as dark-complexioned and broad, with deep-set eyes that registered his presence, with an attention he described, in his statement to Henri, as patient, not predatory, patient. He said, the eyes were the color of dark creek water, he said. The creature made no movement toward him and no movement away from him, and that after some time it turned, without haste, and walked into the timber. He stood at the fallen spruce for a long while after it had gone. He did not check his set that evening. He walked home, and he sat at the kitchen table, and Nora brought him a cup of tea without being asked, and he sat there until the cup was cold. He did not tell Henri what he had said to Nora that night, and Henri did not record it in his summary, and I did not ask Gerald when I sat across from him 6 weeks later. I have thought about that silence for a long time, the silence that was in its place in the document, where some accounting of that night between a husband and wife should have been, and I have come to believe that the silence was itself the account. That what passed between Gerald and Nora Pallister on that evening was the kind of understanding that does not require words and is diminished by them, and that both Henri and Gerald knew this and honoured it by leaving the space empty. The years between 1969 and 1971 were, by Gerald's account, a period of deepening. He continued to leave food at the tree line. The creature continued to split and stack wood, though the amount varied year to year, and there were seasons where no wood appeared, and others where there was more than Gerald could use before spring. He believed, without being able to demonstrate it, that the amount corresponded to how severe the coming winter would be, which he told Henri with the hesitation of a man who knows how something will sound before he says it. He found, in October of 1970, an arrangement of stones at the entrance to the draw that he recognized as being adjacent to a specific set location, and when he examined the area around the set, he found evidence that something large had dug through a deep snowpack in the vicinity of the trap and removed a fox that had been caught and was still alive at the time of the incident. The trap had not been triggered. He did not know what to make of this. He reset the trap and moved it 3 days later, and did not go back to that draw for the rest of the winter. I have thought about the removed fox for 52 years. I do not know what it means. No one knows. Henri had concluded his summary with a recommendation that the matter be filed under a P-series designation, restricted access, no action recommended, no escalation to divisional, no notation in the public register. He had written in his close, clear hand that Gerald Pallister was a reliable witness, that the activity described posed no threat to persons or property in the area, and that intervention of any kind would likely cause more disruption than the situation warranted. That was the entirety of Henri's formal recommendation. It was also, I understood even then, the most extraordinary document I had ever been asked to type. I typed it. I sealed it. I placed it in the restricted cabinet. I wrote PGE 714402 on the envelope in my own hand, and I did not discuss it with Régent Côté or with the duty officers or with anyone else, and when Henri came by my station an hour later and asked me quietly whether the work was done, I told him it was, and he nodded and said, "Thank you, Dorothy," and went back to his office. That was all. That was all that was said. 6 weeks later, in the first week of December of 1971, Henri told me we were going to drive out to the Pallister property to take a supplementary statement. He said, I would act as the official note-taker. He said nothing else about the purpose of the visit, and I asked no questions. We drove out on a Thursday afternoon in Henri's vehicle, a pale green half-ton that he kept in meticulous condition, and we did not talk about what we were going there for during the 40 kilometers out to Hickson. We talked about a deposition that was coming up in January in a property matter, and about whether the roads would hold through December. Henri was a good driver in winter. He was a good driver in every condition. That was one of the many small, reliable things about him that I found myself cataloguing in those years when the work was difficult. Gerald Pallister met us at the door. He was lean and careful in his movements, a man who had spent most of his adult life in country that requires economy and does not reward carelessness. He shook Henri's hand, and then mine with the same gravity. His wife Nora was at the kitchen stove, and she turned when we came in and said good afternoon in a voice that was steady and without performance of any kind. She was a compact woman with strong hands and dark eyes, and the particular quality of self-possession that I have always associated with women who have made a decision they know was right and have not looked back from it. She set cups on the table and poured coffee without asking whether we wanted any. Gerald sat across from Henri, and I sat to one side with my notepad, and the conversation began. I will not reproduce everything Gerald said that afternoon. The formal portion of it, the supplementary details, was unremarkable. He had found additional prints the previous week, larger than the earlier ones he had described to Henri. And he had made some measurements, and he gave those measurements to Henri in the careful way that a man gives measurements he has taken personally and trusts. specifying the instrument used and the conditions. What I want to describe is what happened at approximately 4:15, when the light outside the kitchen window had dropped to the grey-blue of a December dusk in the north, which comes early and with a particular quality of stillness that I have never encountered anywhere else, and that I associate entirely with that hour in that part of the country. Gerald had stopped speaking, and we all, without any coordination, looked toward the window. It was standing at the far edge of the yard, perhaps 60 feet from the house, at the place where the mowed grass ended and the brush began before the tree line. Standing fully upright, motionless, it was looking at the house. I could not have told you, from 60 feet in that light, whether it was looking at the window specifically or at the house as a whole. But Gerald, who had spent 2 years learning what its attention looked like at various distances, told us quietly that it was looking at the window. He said this without alarm. Nora did not turn from the stove. I understood in that moment that she had seen this before enough times, that the protocol of it, the particular stillness that was the correct response, was second nature to her. I did not stand. I did not move toward the window. I sat in my chair with my notepad in my lap, and I looked at the thing in the yard, and I understood, with the clarity that comes from seeing something you have spent years trying to decide whether you believe in, that the decision was no longer mine to make. It was very large. The shoulders read as impossibly wide against the tree line, and the darkness of it, the particular deep brown that absorbed the remaining light rather than reflecting it, gave the figure a quality of mass that was not threatening but was not dismissible either. It was simply there, the way the spruce was there, the way the cold was there, present in the way that large permanent things are present. It stood without motion for approximately 3 minutes, which I counted on the kitchen clock above the stove, and then it turned and walked into the timber, unhurried, completely without haste. The brush at the tree line moved, and then was still. Gerald said, "He comes by most evenings this time of year." Henri said nothing. I wrote that sentence in my notepad, and I underlined it, though I cannot say exactly why. I think I understood, even then, that it was the most important sentence spoken in that kitchen that afternoon. The sentence that confirmed that what the file described was not an encounter or an incident, but an arrangement, ongoing and mutual and years in the making, and that the word most, when Gerald said most evenings, was not a limitation, but a description of something he experienced as reliable. I did not write in my notepad after that. I put the pen down and I left it down. Henri asked Gerald, at some point in the quiet that followed, whether he had told anyone outside the immediate family. Gerald named 2 men. Everett Dufour, who ran the general store in Hickson, and whose property bordered Gerald's to the south, and who had observed the creature on one occasion in the autumn of 1970, when he had come to Gerald's property to return a piece of equipment. Everett had not, by Gerald's account, said a word about what he saw during the 30 minutes he remained at the property afterward, and had driven home and telephoned Gerald that evening and said, in its entirety, that he understood and would say nothing. The second man was Pitt Larocque, the foreman of a road crew that had done survey work in the draw country 2 summers before, and who had observed tracks and other signs during that work, and had made the calculation that the tracks and signs were not something he wanted to put in a government survey report, and had telephoned Gerald on the basis of knowing his father from a fishing camp years earlier to ask what Gerald knew. Gerald had told him enough. Pitt had asked no further questions and had submitted his survey report without mention of anything anomalous, and in the years following had stopped by the Pallister property twice a year, in a manner that Gerald described as checking in, which I understood to mean that Pitt Larocque was not a man who could hold something this size alone, and had found a way to hold it in the company of someone who knew what he held. I have thought about Pitt Larocque many times since. I did not meet him until 1979, at a Christmas gathering at the Pallister House that Henri arranged quietly, and that I attended at Henri's suggestion, and by which time the small informal community of people who knew what was in file PGE 714402 had expanded by exactly the 4 names I have mentioned: Gerald, Nora, Everett, Pitt, not one name more. I have thought about what it costs a person to carry a knowledge like that in a community, where the knowledge would be met, in most quarters, with a response that would have destroyed every one of those people's standing, their credibility, their professional lives. Where the honest report of what Pitt Larocque had seen during that survey would have ended his career with the provincial roads ministry, where the honest report of what Everett Dufour had seen in Gerald Pallister's yard would have been the occasion for a kind of mockery that a small community does not forget and does not forgive. They carried it because Gerald carried it, and Gerald carried it because the alternative was to invite into that draw country a response that everyone present understood would not be gentle, or careful, or deserving of what it would find there. Henri drove us back to Prince George in the dark. The road was clear, the temperature around -15, the sky very bright with stars. About 20 kilometers out from town, he said, and I am quoting him as accurately as I can from 52 years of memory, that a man had the right to live as he chose on his own land, and that what happened at the edge of Gerald Pallister's property was Gerald Pallister's business, and that the file was sealed and would remain sealed, and that the correct designation was no further action required. And he was comfortable with that designation. He did not say anything else about it. I said I agreed. He nodded. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and it was a comfortable silence, the silence of 2 people who have arrived at the same place by slightly different routes, and do not need to describe the journey. The years that followed were in many respects ordinary years. I continued to work at the Prince George detachment. I continued to type documents and maintain records and do the work that the work required. I drove out to the Pallister property for the Christmas gathering in 1979, and again in 1981 and 1984 and 1986, the year Henri retired, and the gathering in 1986 was the one at which Henri told Gerald privately that he had marked the file inactive and had moved it to the long-term storage facility on 3rd Avenue, and that it would in all likelihood never be accessed, because no one outside the 5 of us knew it existed, and because P-series files from small rural detachments in the early 1970s were not the subject of any review process he was aware of. He was right about this. The file was moved in 1993 when the 3rd Avenue facility was decommissioned, and I know it went to the Central Records facility in Kamloops, and I do not know what happened to it after that, whether it was retained or destroyed in one of the periodic culls that the force conducted on aging, restricted files. I asked, once, in 1997, through channels that allowed me to ask without specifying a reason, and was told that the file was not in the active index, which means one of two things, and I have never been certain which. I do not know what happened to the file. No one knows. Henri Vachon died of a heart attack in February of 1994 at his home outside of Williams Lake, where he had retired after a second posting. He was 75. His wife had died the year before. He had no children. I received a card from a former colleague at the Prince George detachment notifying me of his death, and I drove out to Williams Lake for the service, which was small. I stood at the back. Afterward, I sat in my car for a long time in the parking lot of the church, and I was not crying exactly. I was doing something else, something that I have no word for, which is the specific grief of losing the one other person who held a thing with you, the grief not of personal loss, though that was there too, but of becoming the last institutional witness to something that was not yours alone to hold. Gerald and Nora Pallister continued to live on rural Route 4 outside Hickson. Their son Dale, who had been 20 years old in 1971, and who had known, in the way that adult children know the things their parents are keeping, had, by his own account, confirmed his knowledge through a direct encounter in 1973, which he described to me at that 1979 Christmas gathering, in the specific, understated way of a person reporting something they have had 6 years to process. He had been checking his father's equipment shed at dusk in late October, and the creature had been standing at the shed's south wall, its back to Dale, and had turned its head when Dale stopped at the corner of the shed and looked at him in the way Gerald had described, with a patience that was not the patience of something waiting to act, but the patience of something that had long since decided that the act of looking was sufficient. Dale had stood there for a moment, and then he had walked back to the house and gone inside, and had not spoken of it until 1979. And when he spoke of it at the Christmas gathering, he spoke of it the way you speak of something that changed you and that you have finished being changed by. I did not cry until I got back to my house in Prince George that night, and what I was crying about was not fear or grief, but something closer to gratitude, though gratitude for what I could not have told you precisely. Nora died in the spring of 2009, April of that year, after a long illness. Gerald stayed on the property. Dale was in Kamloops by then, working for an engineering firm, and he drove out on weekends when the roads allowed. And he told me at Nora's service that his father was managing, and that the creature had, by Gerald's account, continued its winter visits to the property, though the activity was less regular than it had been in earlier years, which Gerald attributed without sentiment to the creature being older, because Gerald too was older, and he understood older. I stood outside the church after Nora's service with Dale Pallister, and we talked for about 20 minutes, and we talked about Nora and about the property and about the upcoming summer. And we did not talk about the thing we both knew, because there was nothing new to say about it, and because what had been said over the years was sufficient, and because there is a kind of long acquaintance with an impossible fact that no longer requires discussion, only the acknowledgement that you and the other person are both still standing on the same side of it. In the autumn of 2017, Gerald telephoned me. I had not spoken with him in approximately 2 years, not since a brief conversation at a hospital fundraising dinner in Prince George, where we had found ourselves at the same table by coincidence. He telephoned on an October evening and said, without preamble, that the visits had stopped. Not that season. The previous winter, he said, there had been no wood stacked, no prints in the drawer, no presents at the edge of the yard in the December dusk. He had waited the full winter and the following spring and summer, and he was reporting it, now in October, after a second winter without sign, because he believed the absence was permanent. He said this without sadness. He had had 48 years with it, he said. He had had 48 years of knowing that the world was larger than what could be officially accounted for, and that was not a small thing to have had. I sat with a telephone in my hand for a long time after Gerald and I finished speaking. I sat at the kitchen table where the recorder is sitting now, at this same table, in the same chair, and I thought about what he had said, and what I thought was that he was right, that it was not a small thing, and that the not small thing was the entirety of what I had spent 50 years trying to understand how to hold, and that Gerald had just given me the clearest description of it I was ever likely to receive, and that it was enough. Gerald Pallister died on the 28th of December 2022. He was 87 years old. He had lived on rural Route 4 outside Hickson until 6 months before his death, when Dale moved him to a care facility in Prince George. The service was at Sacred Heart Church, the same church where Nora's service had been. I sat in the back pew. Dale read something short and composed. Afterward, there was tea in the hall, and I found Dale by the window, and we talked for a while, and at some point we found ourselves not talking, just standing there with our cups, and I believe we were both thinking the same thing, which is that there was now no one left who had been inside that kitchen on the 7th of December, 1971, except me. And I thought about the file on 3rd Avenue, and then in Kamloops, and then wherever it had gone, whether it had been shredded in some routine administrative purge by people who had no way of knowing what they were shredding. And I thought about Henri in his car on that cold road, saying that a man had the right to live as he chose on his own land. And I thought that the file had not been the record, that the record was what I had in my own memory, which is imperfect and mortal, and that Gerald's death was the moment the record became both more important and more fragile, because I was the only page of it left. I do not know with certainty why I am recording this. I know it is not for an official record. I know it is not for publication. I think it is because I have spent 52 years as a person who kept things precisely, who understood that the value of a document is in its accuracy and its custody, and I cannot let what I know go unrecorded simply because the official record is gone. I am too much the record's clerk for that. I am too much Henri's colleague for that. There is one thing I have not described, and I want to describe it now, because I have thought about it for more than 50 years, and I have never said it aloud, and I need to say it before I stop this recording. On the evening we drove out to the Pallister property in December of 1971, when the creature turned at the tree line and walked back into the timber, I watched it go. Gerald and Henri were watching it go, and Nora was at the stove, and I was watching it go, and just before it reached the tree line, it stopped. It stopped walking, and it stood still for a moment, and then it turned its head, not its body, just its head, and looked back at the house, and I have thought about what it was looking at for the rest of my life. Gerald said later, years later, at one of the Christmas gatherings, that he believed it looked back at the window specifically, at the window where the kitchen light was coming through, and that he believed The reason it did this was because there were new faces in the house, faces it had not seen before, which were mine and Henri's, and that it was noting us the way it noted anything new in the geography of the place that it had claimed in its quiet way as a kind of territory. He said it without drama. He said it was territorial in the way that a man is territorial about a road he has always walked, meaning that the territory was held not by aggression, but by presence and familiarity and the accumulated fact of years. But I have thought about it differently. I have thought about it as something else, something closer to acknowledgement, though I am aware that this is the kind of interpretation that belongs to what I wanted it to mean rather than necessarily to what it meant. I have thought about it as the thing turning to note that the record was being kept, that someone outside the family was in the kitchen, someone from the institution that might have destroyed what was in that drawer, and that the thing at the tree line knew this and had turned to register, with no alarm and no hostility and no change of behavior, that it understood how the world of official record worked, and that it had stood at the edge of that world for years, and had decided, by some calculation I am not able to reconstruct, that Gerald and Nora Pallister were the correct place to stand, and that standing there was enough. I have thought about that half-turn for 52 years. I have thought that it was looking at me. I have thought that it knew I was the one who would be asked to type the file, and that the file would be sealed, and that the sealing was not a defeat of the knowledge, but a different kind of custody, the custody of a record, kept by people who understood what they were keeping and why the keeping mattered. I do not know if that is what it meant. I do not know what any of it meant, finally. I know what I saw. I know what I typed. I know that Gerald Pallister lived for 87 years on rural Route 4, and that the drawer to the east of his property held something that stacked wood and removed live animals from traps and stood at the edge of the yard in the December dusk, with a patience that was, by every account I ever heard, the patience of something that had decided this was where it belonged, and that belonging required no explanation. The world is more full than what can be filed. Henri told me that, once, on a drive back from somewhere, not on that particular night, it was another occasion, and I cannot place it precisely. But I am certain he said it. He was not a man for philosophical observation as a rule, and so when he made one, I kept it. The world is more full than what can be filed. It is the truest thing I know about 50 years of records work, and it is the truest thing I know about what was in file PGE 714402. I am turning off the recorder now. I have said what I set out to say, which is all I wanted. I have been accurate where I could be, and where I could not be. I have said so. That is all a record clerk can do. That is everything.